Sometimes the strongest families are born from the deepest scorn. Sometimes love grows where others see only foolishness. 27 years ago, the people of Bitter Range watched a mountain man named Cormac Judd marry a poor woman named Elsa Rae. The townsfolk laughed and called it the worst match they'd ever seen. A wild man and a beggar woman, with nothing but worn hands and stubborn hope. They said it wouldn't last through winter. They said she'd run back to town within a month. But they didn't understand what Cormac saw in Elsa. He didn't need a rich wife or a pretty face. He needed someone strong enough to stand beside him in a harsh world. Now, 27 years later, the Judd family name commands respect across 3 counties. What happened in those years that turned laughter into admiration? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind cut through Bitter Range like a blade, carrying the promise of an early winter. From the wraparound porch of the Judd homestead, a man could see clear across the valley to where the mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks already dusted with snow. Cormac Judd stood there now, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, watching the morning light paint the landscape in shades of gold and amber. At 52, Cormac carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had earned every line on his face and every scar on his hands. His shoulders, still broad beneath a wool shirt that Elsa had mended more times than either of them could count, bore the weight of responsibility that came with being the head of a family that had clawed its way up from nothing. His hair, more grey than brown now, caught the morning breeze as he surveyed the land that had become his life's work. The homestead stretched before him like a testament to stubborn determination. The main house, built with logs he had felled himself, stood solid and welcoming with its stone chimney, sending lazy smoke into the crisp air. To the east, the barn housed their livestock cattle that grazed on pastures carved from wilderness, horses that knew the mountain trails as well as any man. Beyond that, the workshop where his eldest son Silas had built his blacksmith forge, the sound of hammer on anvil already ringing out in steady rhythm. This had not always been his view. 27 years ago, Cormac Judd had been a different man, entirely a solitary figure, who lived in a one-room cabin higher up in the mountains, coming to town only when necessity demanded it. He had earned his reputation through silence and competence, guiding hunting parties through treacherous passes, tracking lost travelers, and surviving winters that claimed weaker men. The townspeople respected his skills but found him unsettling, this man who could disappear into the wilderness for months and emerge as if he had never left. In his hand, he held his grandfather's Winchester rifle, the wood worn smooth by 3 generations of Judd men. The weapon had fed his family, protected his property, and carried him through lean times when survival depended on a steady hand and a sure shot. His grandfather had carried it during the early days of settlement, when the line between civilization and wilderness remained fluid and dangerous. His father had used it to defend their first homestead before circumstances forced the family to scatter. Now it rested in Cormac's weathered grip, a bridge between past and present. The sound of footsteps on the wooden porch made him turn. Elsa appeared beside him, moving with the quiet grace of a woman who had learned to read her husband's moods in the set of his shoulders and the tilt of his head. At 49, she possessed a beauty that came not from youth, but from strength, weathered and refined. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back in a practical bun, and her dress-on of 3 she owned was clean and mended with the skill of a woman who wasted nothing. "Coffee's fresh if you want some that's actually warm," she said, settling beside him on the porch rail. Her voice carried the slight accent of someone who had learned English alongside her native tongue, a reminder of her heritage that some in town had once seen as another mark against her. Cormac accepted the steaming cup she offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange a small intimacy that still carried the weight of 27 years of partnership. "Silas is up early again," he observed, nodding toward the sound of the forge. "Boy's got your work ethic and my stubbornness. Elsa replied with a small smile. That's either a blessing or a curse, depending on how you look at it. Their eldest son had indeed inherited the best and most challenging traits from both parents. Silas, at 27, possessed his father's quiet intensity and his mother's unwavering determination. As a blacksmith, he had earned respect throughout the county for the quality of his work and his fair dealing. Yet those who knew him well recognized the careful control he maintained over a temper that could flare as hot as his forge when roused. Levi rode out to check the north pasture before dawn, Elsa continued, settling more comfortably against the porch rail. Said he wanted to count the cattle before the weather turns. Levi, their second son at 24, had grown into the protector of the family, the one who stood ready to defend what they had built. Where Silas channeled his intensity into craftsmanship, Levi expressed his through vigilance and strength. He had never lost a fight, not because he sought conflict, but because he understood that in a place like Bitter Range, strength respected strength, and weakness invited trouble. Elias took the wagon to town this morning, Elsa added. Said he had some trading to do, but I suspect he's also gathering information. You know how he listens. Their third son possessed perhaps the sharpest mind in the family. At 22, Elias could read people and situations with an accuracy that sometimes unsettled others. He understood the value of information, the way knowledge could be as valuable as gold in the right circumstances. His silver eyes missed little, and his tongue could be sharp when necessity demanded it. "And Asher?" Cormac asked, though he already knew the answer. "Still sleeping," Elsa said with the indulgent tone of a mother speaking of her youngest. "Though not for much longer if I know him. He's been restless lately, wanting to prove himself." At 19, Asher remained the unknown quantity in the family equation. Stronger than most men twice his age, he possessed all the physical gifts of his brothers, but hadn't yet found the focus that would channel those abilities toward a clear purpose. He chafed at being the youngest, eager to demonstrate that he belonged among men who had already proven themselves. Cormac sipped his coffee and considered the empire they had built from nothing. The land stretched for miles in every direction, marked by fence lines that he and his sons had strung themselves, dotted with buildings they had raised with their own hands. Cattle bearing the Judd brand grazed on grass that grew from soil they had cleared and cultivated. It represented a fortune in livestock, land, and improvements wealth that had accumulated slowly, steadily, through decades of back-breaking work and careful management. Yet it was more than mere property. It was proof of what could be accomplished when two people committed themselves fully to a shared vision, when they refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon them. Every fence post driven into the hard ground, every building raised against the mountain weather, every successful harvest represented a small victory against those who had predicted their failure. "Do you ever think about those early days?" Elsa asked quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Cormac considered the question while he watched a hawk circle lazily over the valley. "Every day," he admitted. "Hard not to, when you're surrounded by everything we built since then." Those early days had been brutal in ways that went beyond mere physical hardship. The cabin where they had started their married life measured barely 12 feet square, with a dirt floor and walls that let in the wind. They had owned little more than the clothes on their backs, a few basic tools, and the determination to prove wrong everyone who had bet against them. The first winter had nearly broken them, not from cold or hunger, but from the crushing weight of isolation and the constant awareness that failure would validate every cruel prediction. "I was terrified," Elsa said, her voice so quiet that Cormac had to lean closer to hear her. "Not of you, never of you, but of failing you, of proving them right." The admission surprised him, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Elsa had always been honest about her fears, even when honesty made her vulnerable. It was one of the qualities that had drawn him to her from the beginning, her willingness to face difficult truths without flinching. "You never showed it," he said. "I couldn't afford to. Neither of us could." She was right, of course. In those early days, doubt would have been a luxury they couldn't afford. Every day had required complete commitment to the belief that they could succeed where others expected them to fail. There had been no room for second-guessing, no time for self-pity, no space for anything but the work that needed to be done. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Levi emerged from the morning mist, riding the big bay gelding that had been his constant companion for the past 3 years. Even at a distance, Cormac could read tension in his son's posture, the way he sat straighter in the saddle than usual. Levi pulled up at the porch steps and dismounted with the fluid motion of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. His resemblance to his father was strong, the same broad shoulders and weathered features, the same careful way of moving that suggested strength held in reserve. But where Cormac's eyes had learned patience through years of hard experience, Levi's still burned with the intensity of a man who saw the world in terms of problems to be solved and challenges to be met. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the gravity that made men listen when he spoke. "Found tracks along the north fence line. Boot prints and horse hooves, but not from any of our stock. Someone's been watching the property." Cormac set down his coffee cup, the domestic peace of the morning suddenly shattered. In a place like Bitter Range, unwanted visitors usually meant trouble of one kind or another. "How many?" "At least 3 men, maybe 4. They stayed back in the tree line, but they got a good view of the whole north pasture and the approaches to the house." Elsa moved closer to her husband, not from fear but from the instinct to present a united front in the face of potential threat. After 27 years of marriage, they had learned to function as a single unit when circumstances demanded it. "Any idea how long they were there?" Cormac asked. "Tracks look fresh, probably yesterday evening, maybe earlier this morning." Levi's jaw tightened with controlled anger. They weren't trying too hard to hide their sign. Either they're not very good at what they're doing, or they wanted us to know they were there. The implications settled over the porch like a cold wind. Men who wanted to be discovered usually had a message to send, and that message was rarely friendly. In the isolated country around Bitter Range, where the nearest law enforcement was a day's ride away, such visits often preceded demands for money, threats against property, or worse. "Where are your brothers?" Cormac asked. "Silas is at the forge. I sent word for him to stay alert. Asher's probably still in bed, and Elias should be back from town soon." Cormac nodded, his mind already working through possibilities and preparations. The homestead had been designed with defense in mind, though they had hoped never to need such precautions. The house commanded good sight lines in all directions, the barn could serve as a secondary stronghold if necessary, and the workshop provided both cover and access to tools that could serve as weapons. "We'll wait and see what they want," he decided, "but we'll be ready for whatever that turns out to be." As if summoned by his words, the sound of wagon wheels approached from the direction of town. Elias appeared driving their freight wagon, but his usually relaxed posture suggested urgency, barely held in check. He pulled up beside Levi's horse and dismounted quickly. "We need to talk," he said, his silver eyes moving between his parents and his brother. "All of us. There's news from town that changes everything." The morning peace of the Judd homestead had officially ended. The family gathered in the main room of the house, the space that had served as kitchen, dining room, and meeting hall for 27 years. Elsa poured coffee while the men settled around the heavy oak table that Cormac had built during their second winter together. The morning light streaming through the window seemed somehow dimmer now, as if the approaching storm clouds had already begun their work. Elias reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, its official appearance immediately commanding attention. The paper bore the seal of the territorial government, and even from across the table, Cormac could see that portions of it had been torn whether by accident or design. He couldn't tell. "This showed up at the land office yesterday." Elias began, smoothing the document on the table. "Fellow named Marcus Whitmore from Denver filed a claim on our property. Says he has prior rights to everything from the creek bottom to the ridgeline." The silence that followed was profound. Levi leaned forward to examine the papers, his face darkening as he read. Silas had arrived from the forge, still wearing his leather apron, and stood behind his father's chair with his arms crossed. Asher, finally awakened by the commotion, appeared in the doorway wearing the confused expression of someone trying to catch up with events that had moved beyond his understanding. Prior rights? Cormac's voice carried the dangerous quiet that his sons had learned to respect. We've been working this land for 27 years, built everything on it with our own hands. That's what I told the clerk, Elias continued. But Whitmore's got documentation that supposedly predates our homestead claim. Says his family was granted this land by the territorial government back in 1851, before we ever set foot here. Elsa studied the torn deed with the careful attention she had once devoted to reading the few books they owned during those early winters. Her education might have been limited, but her mind was sharp, and she had learned to spot inconsistencies in the various documents that came with running a ranch. There's something wrong with this, she said quietly. Look at the dates and see how the paper is different in some places, like parts of it were added later. Levi picked up the document and held it to the light. She's right. This section here doesn't match the rest. Different ink, different handwriting. Forgery? Silas asked, his blacksmith's eye for detail making him particularly sensitive to such inconsistencies. Maybe, Elias said, but proving it might be harder than we think. Whitmore's got lawyers, good ones from what I heard in town. He's also got money to back up his claims. The weight of the situation began to settle over the family like a heavy blanket. A legal challenge to their land ownership threatened everything they had built, everything they had sacrificed to achieve. Without the land, the cattle would have to be sold, the buildings would belong to someone else, and the family would be scattered to whatever opportunities they could find elsewhere. What did people in town say? Cormac asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Elias exchanged glances with his brothers before answering. Mixed reactions. Some folks remember how hard you and Ma worked to build this place. They think it's wrong for someone to come along after all these years and try to take it away. And the others? The others remember the old days. Remember when people used to laugh about the mountain man and his poor wife trying to make a go of it up here. They're wondering if maybe this Whitmore fellow has a point, if maybe there was something irregular about how we got the land in the first place. The admission stung, but Cormac had expected it. Despite everything they had accomplished, despite the respect they had earned through decades of hard work and fair dealing, there would always be those who remembered the early days when the Judd family had been seen as an unlikely pairing doomed to failure. For some people, success was harder to forgive than failure. There's more, Elias continued reluctantly. Whitmore's not just filing papers and waiting for the courts to decide. He showed up in town yesterday with 6 men. Professional types, if you know what I mean. They're staying at the hotel and asking questions about our operation. What kind of questions? Levi's voice carried the edge that appeared whenever he sensed a threat to his family. Property boundaries, water rights, how many cattle we run, where our markets are, the kind of information you'd want if you were planning to take over a working ranch. Asher finally spoke up from his position in the doorway. So what do we do? Just sit here and let them steal everything we've worked for? The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Each member of the family knew that their response to this challenge would define not just their immediate future, but their identity as a family that had always faced adversity head-on. Cormac stood and walked to the window, looking out over the land that had become his life's work. Every fence post, every building, every improvement represented hours of labor under sun, rain, and snow. The cattle that grazed in the distance bore the Judd brand that he had designed himself, burned into their hides with iron heated in Silas's forge. This was more than property. It was the physical manifestation of everything he and Elsa had dreamed of during those long winter nights in the tiny cabin where their marriage had begun. We fight, he said simply, but we fight smart. Elias, you'll handle the legal side. Find out everything you can about this Whitmore and his claim. Look for weaknesses, inconsistencies, anything that might help us challenge his documentation. Elias nodded, already mentally cataloguing the contacts he would need to pursue. His years of trading had taught him the value of information and the networks needed to obtain it. "Levi, you'll handle security. If Whitmore's men are watching us, we need to be watching them too, but no confrontations unless they force it. We can't afford to give them any excuse to claim we're the aggressors." "Understood," Levi replied, though his expression suggested he would welcome a more direct approach to the problem. "Silas, keep the forge running and be ready to make whatever we need, tools, hardware, anything that might give us an advantage. And spread the word through your customers. We need to know who's supporting us and who isn't." The eldest son nodded grimly. His position as the county's premier blacksmith gave him access to a network of farmers, ranchers, and townspeople who would be crucial allies in any extended struggle. "What about me?" Asher asked, his youth making the question sound more desperate than he probably intended. Cormac turned from the window to study his youngest son. At 19, Asher possessed all the physical tools needed to contribute to the family's defense, but he lacked the experience and judgment that would come with time. Yet this crisis might well provide the crucible in which those qualities could be forged. "You'll work with me," Cormac decided. "We're going to prepare this place for whatever comes next, and you're going to learn everything I can teach you about survival and strategy." Elsa had remained quiet during the distribution of assignments, but her silence didn't indicate passivity. She was thinking, planning, considering angles that her husband and sons might overlook. "What about the community?" she asked. "People who remember the early days, who know what we went through to build this place. They might be willing to speak up if they understand what's at stake." It was a shrewd observation. While legal documents and property rights would be important in any court proceeding, the testimony of long-time residents could provide crucial corroboration of the family's legitimate claim to the land. More importantly, community support could influence how local officials handled the dispute. "Good point," Cormac acknowledged. "You know those people better than any of us. If anyone can convince them to stand with us, it's you." The family spent the next hour reviewing everything they knew about their situation and refining their plans. The torn land deed lay on the table like an accusation, its official seals and legal language representing a threat that was both abstract and devastatingly real. If Marcus Whitmore succeeded in his claim, the Judd family would lose not just their property, but their identity, as people who had overcome every obstacle through determination and mutual support. As the meeting broke up, each family member understanding their role in the struggle ahead, Cormac found himself alone with the disputed document. He picked it up and studied it more carefully, noting the details that Elsa and Levi had identified as suspicious. The inconsistencies were subtle but real, the kind of flaws that might be overlooked by a casual observer, but would become significant under close scrutiny. Yet even if they could prove the document was fraudulent, they would still face the challenge of fighting a well-funded opponent with professional legal representation. Marcus Whitmore clearly had resources that the Judd family lacked, and he had chosen his timing carefully, waiting until their improvements to the land made it valuable enough to justify an expensive legal battle. The sound of approaching horses drew Cormac's attention back to the window. 3 riders were approaching the house at a measured pace, their professional bearing immediately identifying them as the men Elias had mentioned. They rode expensive horses and carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through a combination of money and intimidation. Cormac stepped onto the porch as the riders pulled up at a respectful distance. The leader, a man in his 40s with the soft look of someone who made his living with words rather than physical labor, dismounted and approached with a document case under his arm. "Mr. Judd, my name is Harrison Pike. I represent Mr. Marcus Whitmore in a matter concerning this property." The formal introduction carried the weight of legal process and official business. Pike's tone was polite but firm, the voice of someone delivering news that he knew would be unwelcome. "I'm here to serve you with official notice of Mr. Whitmore's claim to this land and to inform you that you have 30 days to vacate the premises voluntarily. After that time, we'll be forced to pursue eviction through the territorial courts." Cormac accepted the legal papers without comment, his face revealing nothing of the anger that burned inside him. 30 days to abandon everything they had built, everything they had worked for, everything that defined them as a family. "You'll also want to know," Pike continued, "that Mr. Whitmore is prepared to be generous in this matter. He's willing to compensate you for improvements to the property and to purchase your livestock at fair market value. All you have to do is acknowledge his rightful ownership and agree to a peaceful transition." The offer was calculated to sound reasonable, even generous. To an outside observer, it might seem like Whitmore was going out of his way to treat the Judd family fairly. But Cormac recognized it for what it was, an attempt to make their displacement look voluntary and legitimate. "And if we refuse?" he asked quietly. Pike's expression hardened slightly. "Then we'll have to let the courts decide. I should warn you that legal proceedings can be expensive and unpredictable. Mr. Whitmore has considerable resources at his disposal, and his claim appears to be quite solid." The threat was delivered politely, but it was unmistakably a threat. Submit quietly or face a legal battle that could leave the family not just homeless, but financially ruined. Cormac folded the legal papers and tucked them into his shirt pocket. "We'll be in touch," he said simply. Pike nodded and remounted his horse. "I hope you'll consider Mr. Whitmore's generous offer carefully, Mr. Judd. It would be unfortunate if this matter had to become contentious." The three riders departed at the same measured pace, leaving Cormac alone on the porch with the weight of their ultimatum. 30 days to surrender everything or face a legal battle against an opponent with unlimited resources and questionable scruples. Inside the house, he could hear his family discussing their options, their voices carrying the tension of people who understood that their entire world had just been threatened. Yet there was also something else in those voices: determination, anger, and the kind of stubborn resistance that had carried them through every previous crisis. The torn land deed in Pike's document case might represent Marcus Whitmore's claim to their property, but it also represented something else: proof that some fights were worth having, regardless of the odds. The steady rhythm of hammer on anvil had always been the heartbeat of the Judd homestead, but now it carried a different urgency. Silas worked his father's old hammer with practiced precision, each strike shaping not just iron, but also his family's resistance to the threat that had descended upon them like a sudden storm. The hammer itself told a story worn smooth by 3 generations of blacksmiths' hands, its head perfectly balanced from decades of use, its handle darkened by sweat and shaped by countless hours of work. Cormac had carried it when he first learned the trade from his own father, back in the days before circumstances forced the family to scatter. Now it rested in Silas's capable grip, a bridge between past and present, a symbol of skills passed down and traditions maintained. "You're working that iron like it owes you money," came a familiar voice from the forge doorway. Silas looked up to see Thomas Brennan, one of the local ranchers whose property bordered the Judd, spread to the south. Brennan was a solid man in his 50s, someone who had arrived in Bitter Range around the same time as Cormac and Elsa, but had come with capital and connections that made his path considerably easier. "Just trying to keep up with orders," Silas replied, setting down the hammer and wiping his hands on his leather apron. "What brings you by, Tom?" Brennan stepped into the workshop, his eyes taking in the organized chaos of tools, materials, and works in progress that filled the space. The forge glowed with heat, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the air with the distinctive smell of hot metal and coal smoke. "Heard there might be some trouble up your way," Brennan said carefully. "Thought you folks might need a friend." The word friend carried weight in country like this, where neighbors might be separated by miles, but bound together by the mutual understanding that survival often depended on cooperation and support. Silas studied the older man's face, reading genuine concern mixed with something that might have been curiosity. "Depends on what you've heard," Silas replied cautiously. "That some fellow from Denver is claiming your pa never had proper title to this land, that he's got lawyers and court papers saying the whole spread belongs to him." News traveled fast in small communities, especially news involving potential scandal or conflict. Silas wasn't surprised that word had spread, but he was interested in how the story was being told and received. "That's about the size of it," he confirmed. "Fellow named Whitmore. Showed up with documentation that looks official enough, but we've got reasons to think it might not be legitimate." Brennan nodded slowly, his weathered features reflecting the kind of thinking that came with years of dealing with complex problems. "Your father's always been a straight shooter. Can't say the same for every newcomer who shows up with fancy papers and big claims." The implied support was encouraging, but Silas knew better than to assume it represented a universal sentiment. For every neighbor like Brennan who remembered Cormac's integrity and hard work, there might be another who recalled the early days when the Judd family had been seen as unlikely to succeed. "We're planning to fight it through the courts," Silas said, "but it's going to be expensive, and this Whitmore fellow seems to have plenty of resources." "That's what worries me," Brennan admitted. "Man with that kind of money doesn't usually target one homestead unless he's got bigger plans. Makes me wonder what he might be after next." It was a shrewd observation. If Whitmore succeeded in claiming the Judd property, he would establish a precedent that could threaten other long-time residents whose documentation might not withstand scrutiny from well-funded lawyers. The implications went beyond one family's struggle to encompass the security of the entire community. "You think others might be willing to help?" Silas asked. "Some will, some won't. Folks remember how hard your parents worked to build this place, but they also remember the talk from back then about whether a mountain man and a poor woman could really make a go of it." The honesty was painful but necessary. Silas had grown up aware that his family's success had come, despite rather than because of community expectations. While their eventual prosperity had earned respect, it hadn't entirely erased the memory of initial skepticism. "What would it take to get more people on our side?" Silas asked. Brennan considered the question while he examined a horseshoe that Silas had been working on. The craftsmanship was excellent, even, properly shaped, finished with the attention to detail that had made the younger man's reputation throughout the county. "Proof," Brennan said finally. "Something concrete that shows this Whitmore is running a game on all of us. People might overlook a questionable land claim if it only affects one family, but if they think their own property might be next, they'll pay attention." It was sound advice, confirming what Silas had already suspected. The battle for community support would be won not through appeals to sentiment or loyalty, but through demonstrating that the threat to the Judd family represented a broader danger to everyone's security. Over the next several days, Silas found himself at the center of an informal information network that flowed through his blacksmith shop. Customers who came for horseshoes or tool repairs inevitably brought news and gossip, creating opportunities to gauge community sentiment and share the family's perspective on the developing conflict. The responses varied considerably. Some customers, particularly those who had dealt with the Judd family for years and witnessed their reliability and fair dealing, expressed support and outrage at what they saw as an attempt to steal earned prosperity. Others remained non-committal, adopting a wait-and-see attitude that reflected either caution or genuine uncertainty about where justice lay. Most troubling were the few who seemed almost pleased by the family's predicament, as if Whitmore's challenge validated long-held suspicions that the Judd's success had come too easily or through questionable means. These individuals didn't express their satisfaction directly, but Silas could read it in their carefully neutral comments and in the way they avoided meeting his eyes. "You notice how people are treating us differently?" Asher asked one evening, as he helped his brother organize tools in the workshop. Silas had indeed noticed. The subtle changes in behavior were unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read them. Conversations that stopped when family members approached, customers who completed their business quickly instead of lingering to chat, neighbors who waved from a distance instead of stopping to visit. "Fear makes people careful," Silas replied. "They don't want to pick sides until they know which way things are going to go. Seems like they should know us well enough by now to trust we're in the right." The comment revealed Asher's youth and relative inexperience with the complexities of human nature. At 19, he still believed that right and wrong should be easily distinguishable and that good people would naturally support good causes. The reality was more complicated, shaped by self-interest, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable truth that most people preferred to avoid conflict whenever possible. Knowing someone and trusting them aren't always the same thing, Silas explained, especially when there's money and legal trouble involved. The workshop fell quiet, except for the sound of wind moving through the trees outside. Both brothers understood that they were facing not just a legal challenge, but a test of everything their family had built in terms of community relationships and reputation. The outcome would determine not only whether they kept their land, but whether they retained their standing as respected members of the local community. Pa wants me to learn everything he can teach me about survival and strategy, Asher said after a long pause. But I keep thinking the most important thing might be learning who we can really count on when things get difficult. It was a mature observation from someone who had previously seemed focused mainly on proving his physical capabilities. The crisis was already changing Asher, forcing him to consider aspects of life that went beyond strength and courage to encompass judgment and understanding of human nature. That's probably the hardest lesson of all, Silas agreed, and the most important one. As the days passed, the rhythm of work at the forge continued, but it was accompanied by a growing sense of isolation. The Judd family was discovering that prosperity and respect, while valuable, might not be enough to guarantee support when that support required others to take risks or make sacrifices. Yet there were encouraging signs as well. Brennan returned several times, each visit bringing news of conversations with other ranchers and farmers who shared concerns about the precedent that Whitmore's claim might establish. A core group of supporters was beginning to emerge, people who understood that allowing one family's rights to be trampled could lead to everyone's security being threatened. The hammer continued to ring against the anvil, each strike shaping metal and resolve in equal measure. Whatever came next, the Judd family would face it with the tools and skills that had carried them through every previous challenge, backed by the certainty that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds or the cost. Elias spread his ledger book across the kitchen table, its leather-bound pages filled with 27 years of meticulous record-keeping. Every transaction, every improvement, every investment in the property had been documented in his careful handwriting, creating a detailed financial history of the Judd family's rise from poverty to prosperity. The ledger represented more than mere bookkeeping. It was proof of legitimate ownership established through decades of continuous investment and improvement. Each entry told part of the story: the purchase of their first breeding bull in 1855, the cost of materials for expanding the house in 1860, payments to neighbors for help with harvest, sales of cattle to markets in Denver and Colorado Springs. "Look at this," Elias said, running his finger down a column of figures. "We've invested over $15,000 in improvements to this property over the years. Buildings, fencing, livestock, equipment all documented and accounted for." Cormac leaned over his son's shoulder to study the entries, marveling at the thoroughness of records he had often taken for granted. Elias had begun keeping the books when he was barely 16, displaying an aptitude for numbers and organization that had proved invaluable as the family's operations grew more complex. "This should help with any court proceedings," Cormac observed. "Hard to argue we don't have legitimate claim when we can prove how much we've invested in making the land productive." "It's more than that," Elias replied, turning to another section of the ledger. "See these entries? They show we've been paying territorial taxes on this property since 1854. Every year, without fail. If Whitmore's family really had prior claim, why weren't they paying taxes? Where are their records of investment and improvement?" The questions pointed to fundamental weaknesses in Whitmore's position that might be exploited through careful legal strategy. A legitimate landowner would have left a paper trail of tax payments, improvements, and ongoing management of the property. The absence of such documentation would raise serious questions about the validity of any claim to prior ownership. Elsa joined them at the table, bringing coffee and the kind of focused attention she devoted to important family discussions. Her business sense had been honed through years of managing household finances and helping with decisions about livestock and land use. While she might not have formal education in legal matters, she possessed intuitive understanding of fairness and evidence. "What about witnesses?" she asked. "People who remember when we first came here, who saw us build everything from nothing." "That's exactly what I've been thinking about," Elias replied. "Old Peterson at the general store has records going back to territorial days. He should be able to confirm when we started buying supplies for major construction projects. And Doc Williams delivered all of us boys she could testify about how long the family's been established here." The strategy was sound. Combine documentary evidence with witness testimony to create an overwhelming case for legitimate ownership based on decades of continuous occupation and improvement. Yet, even as they planned their legal defense, the family remained aware that they were fighting an opponent with significantly greater resources. "I spent some time in town yesterday," Elias continued, "trying to learn more about this Whitmore fellow. What I found out isn't encouraging." He opened a different section of the ledger where he had been keeping notes on their adversary. The information was fragmentary but troubling in its implications. Whitmore's not just some rich man from Denver with a questionable land claim. He's been involved in similar disputes in Colorado and Wyoming. Always the same pattern shows up, with documentation claiming prior rights to properties that have been improved by homesteaders, offers to buy them out at below market prices, and if that doesn't work, ties them up in expensive legal proceedings until they give up. The revelation cast their situation in a different light. Rather than facing an isolated dispute over property rights, they were confronting someone who had made a business of exploiting weaknesses in territorial land records to dispossess legitimate settlers. "How many families has he done this to?" Cormac asked. "At least 6 that I could confirm, probably more. Some fought and lost everything. Others took his buyout offers rather than risk complete ruin. Either way, Whitmore ended up with valuable property for a fraction of what it was worth." The information was both encouraging and alarming. On one hand, it suggested a pattern of behavior that might be used to challenge Whitmore's credibility and motives. On the other hand, it demonstrated that he had succeeded often enough to make the strategy profitable, which implied either legal vulnerabilities in homestead claims or corruption in the territorial court system. "What happened to the families who fought him?" Elsa asked quietly. Elias hesitated before answering, clearly reluctant to share news that might discourage his parents. "Most lost their property and ended up leaving the territory. Legal costs ate up whatever resources they had, and even when they could prove problems with Whitmore's documentation, the courts seemed to favor the side with better lawyers." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Fighting Whitmore meant risking not just their property, but their entire financial future. Losing could leave them not just homeless, but destitute, forced to start over at an age when such recovery would be difficult, if not impossible. Yet the alternative, accepting Whitmore's buyout offer, would mean surrendering everything they had worked to build and validating a system that rewarded predatory behavior over legitimate achievement. "There's something else," Elias said, turning to the final pages of his notes. "I talked to a lawyer in town, a fellow named Mitchell, who's handled property disputes before. He thinks our case is strong, but he was honest about the challenges we'd face." "What kind of challenges?" Cormac asked. "Cost, mainly. A case like this could drag on for months, maybe years. Legal fees could run into thousands of dollars, money we'd have to pay whether we win or lose. And there's no guarantee the territorial courts would rule in our favor, even with strong evidence." The financial reality was stark. While the family had achieved comfortable prosperity, they didn't possess the kind of liquid assets needed to sustain a prolonged legal battle against a well-funded opponent. Their wealth was tied up in land, livestock, and improvements assets that would be difficult to convert to cash without undermining the very thing they were trying to protect. Mitchell suggested we might want to consider a settlement. Elias continued reluctantly. not accepting Whitmore's offer, but negotiating something that would let us keep part of the property while acknowledging his claim to the rest. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. From a purely practical standpoint, it might represent the most rational response to their situation: cut losses while something could still be salvaged. Yet it would also represent a fundamental betrayal of everything the family had worked to achieve and prove. "That's not acceptable," Cormac said firmly. "This land belongs to us. We've earned it through 27 years of sweat and sacrifice. I won't give up 1 acre to someone who's trying to steal it through legal trickery." Elsa reached across the table to cover her husband's hand with her own, a gesture of support that carried the weight of shared resolve. "We've faced worse odds before. When we started out, everyone said we'd never succeed. They were wrong then, and this Whitmore fellow is wrong now." Asher appeared in the kitchen doorway, having finished his morning chores. His presence reminded everyone that this struggle would define not just their immediate future, but the legacy they passed on to the next generation. Surrender now would teach their sons that hard work and determination could be overcome by money and legal manipulation. "What can I do to help?" Asher asked, settling into a chair beside his brother. Elias looked up from his ledger, with the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. "You're good with horses, and you know the country better than most people. I need someone to ride to Colorado Springs and Denver, maybe even further if necessary. We need to find the families Whitmore has done this to before, get them to tell their stories, maybe even testify on our behalf." It was ambitious, potentially dangerous, and would require weeks of travel through difficult country. Yet it also represented their best chance of exposing Whitmore's pattern of predatory behavior and building a case that went beyond simple property dispute to encompass fraud and systematic exploitation. "When do I leave?" Asher asked without hesitation. The immediate acceptance of a difficult and potentially dangerous assignment marked another step in the youngest son's maturation. The boy who had once chafed at being excluded from adult responsibilities was now volunteering for a mission that would require considerable judgment and skill. "Give me a few more days to identify the best prospects," Elias replied. "I want to make sure you're not riding blind into situations that might not help our cause." As the family discussion continued, the ledger book remained open on the table, its pages filled with evidence of legitimate ownership and honest achievement. Yet everyone understood that documentation alone might not be enough to protect what they had built. The battle ahead would require every resource they possessed, financial, legal, and personal, deployed with strategic precision against an opponent who had already proved his willingness to destroy families in pursuit of profit. The next few weeks would test everything they had learned about survival, determination, and the bonds that held families together when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. But they would face that test with the same stubborn resolve that had carried them through every previous challenge, armed with the certainty that some principles were worth defending regardless of the cost. In the depths of the homestead's foundation, hidden beneath loose stones that Cormac had placed there decades earlier, lay a faded daguerreotype that would change everything. The photograph, protected by oiled leather and wrapped in fading silk, showed 2 people standing before a modest Cabina man with Cormac's strong jawline and a woman whose gentle eyes seemed to hold secrets that time had nearly erased. Elsa discovered it while searching for any documentation that might support their legal case. She had been examining every corner of the house, looking through old trunks and forgotten storage spaces, when her fingers found the loose stones in the foundation wall of the root cellar. "Cormac!" she called, her voice carrying an unusual tension. "You need to see this." He found her in the cellar, holding the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. The image was old, dating back to the early days of photography, and the formal poses and clothing suggested it had been taken sometime in the 1840s. "Who are they?" Elsa asked quietly. Cormac studied the photograph, his weathered features reflecting a mixture of recognition and confusion. The man in the image bore such a strong resemblance to him that they might have been brothers, yet the clothing and setting clearly predated his own arrival in Bitter Range. "I think it's my father," he said slowly, "and my mother. But that can't be right. They never lived here. We were back in Missouri when I was growing up." Beneath the photograph, Elsa found other documents. A deed to property in Bitter Range, dated 1849, signed by territorial authorities and bearing the name James Judd. Land survey maps showing boundaries that encompassed not just their current homestead, but thousands of additional acres stretching into the surrounding mountains. Letters written in a woman's careful script, addressed to family members and describing the hardships and hopes of early settlement life. The implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, they suggested that Cormac's parents had established legitimate claim to their property years before he had arrived to homestead it himself. Rather than being a newcomer who had earned his place through hard work, he might actually be reclaiming land that had belonged to his family all along. "Why wouldn't you have known about this?" Elsa asked, spreading the survey maps on the cellar floor. Cormac shook his head, struggling to reconcile these revelations with his memories of childhood and family history. "My father never talked much about his past. Said there were things better left buried. My mother died when I was young, and after that, Pa seemed to want to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had happened before." The letters provided additional clues. Written by Sarah Judd to her sister back in Ohio, they described the challenges of establishing a homestead in the remote mountains of Colorado Territory. The correspondence painted a picture of determination mixed with growing desperation as harsh winters and hostile conditions took their toll on the young family. "James is working himself to exhaustion," one letter read. "The land is rich but unforgiving, and we're so far from any neighbors that sometimes I wonder if we've made a terrible mistake. Little Cormac is strong, though he has his father's stubborn streak and seems to thrive on the challenges that would break lesser children." Another letter, dated 2 years later, revealed the tragedy that had shaped Cormac's childhood. "The fever took James 3 days ago. I'm alone now with Cormac, and winter is coming. I don't know if we can survive another season here. My brother has written asking us to come back to Missouri, and I'm beginning to think he might be right." The final letter in the collection, written in a shakier hand that suggested illness or exhaustion, contained the key to understanding why Cormac had grown up knowing nothing about his family's Colorado legacy. "I've decided to accept my brother's offer. This place has taken too much from us already. I'm packing what we can carry and leaving the rest. Maybe someday Cormac will be strong enough to come back and claim what should be his, but I can't give him that chance if I let this wilderness kill us both." Elsa looked up from the letters with tears in her eyes. She left because she had to, but she made sure the legal claim stayed valid in case you ever returned. The documents told a story of tragedy, survival, and unfinished business that had waited decades for resolution. James and Sarah Judd had established legitimate claim to thousands of acres in Bitter Range, but circumstances had forced them to abandon their dream before it could be fully realized. Now their son had unknowingly returned to complete what they had started, building his own homestead on land that had always belonged to his family. "This changes everything," Cormac said, his voice heavy with the weight of revelations that recontextualized his entire life story. "If these documents are authentic, Whitmore's claim becomes meaningless. Our family had prior rights to this land going back more than 30 years. Yet even as the implications became clear, both he and Elsa understood that proving the authenticity of decades-old documents would present its own challenges. The photographs and letters were compelling, but they would need corroboration from official sources and contemporary witnesses to stand up in territorial court. "We need to tell the boys," Elsa said, carefully gathering the precious documents, "and we need to get these to Elias so he can figure out how to use them in our legal case." They climbed out of the root cellar and walked back toward the house, each carrying pieces of a puzzle that had suddenly revealed a completely different picture of their situation. The homestead around them looked the same, but its meaning had been transformed by the knowledge that this wasn't simply land they had claimed through homestead. Right-sit was a family inheritance that had waited decades to be reclaimed. Inside the house, they found their 4 sons gathered around the kitchen table, discussing security arrangements and strategy for the ongoing conflict with Whitmore. The conversation stopped when Cormac and Elsa entered, carrying the newly discovered materials. "We found something," Cormac announced, setting the daguerreotype on the table where his sons could see it. The reaction was immediate and profound. Silas leaned forward to examine the photograph more closely, his blacksmith's eye noting details of craftsmanship and age that supported its apparent authenticity. Levi studied the documents with the careful attention of someone assessing potential evidence in a life-or-death struggle. Elias immediately grasped the legal implications, while Asher simply stared at the image of grandparents he had never known existed. "These are your parents?" Silas asked quietly. "I believe so, and if these documents are legitimate, they establish our family's claim to this land, going back to 1,849 years before Whitmore says his family had any rights here." Elias took charge of the legal documents, spreading them carefully on the table and examining each page with the thoroughness of someone who understood their potential importance. The deed, survey maps, and correspondence painted a picture of legitimate settlement and legal claim that predated any documentation Whitmore had produced. "This is incredible," Elias said. "If we can prove these are authentic, Whitmore's case falls apart completely. Not only do we have prior claim, but we can show continuous family ownership for over 3 decades. Big if," Levi observed. "How do we prove documents this old are real?" It was the crucial question. While the materials appeared authentic to untrained eyes, establishing their legitimacy in legal proceedings would require expert testimony and supporting evidence that might be difficult to obtain. "Land office records," Elias replied, his mind already working through possibilities. "If Pa's father really filed these claims, there should be copies in the territorial archives. Survey records, tax assessments, maybe even correspondence with government officials." "What about witnesses?" Asher asked. "People who might remember the original homestead." Cormac considered the question while studying the photograph of his parents. "Most of the old-timers from those days are gone, but there might be a few left who remember hearing stories about the early settlement period." The discussion continued for hours as the family worked through the implications of their discovery and developed strategies for using the new evidence effectively. The documents represented potential salvation, but they also raised new questions about family history and the circumstances that had led to decades of separation from their true inheritance. As evening approached and the family began to disperse to their various responsibilities, Cormac found himself alone with the photograph of his parents. The faces that looked back at him across the decades seemed to carry both hope and warning, hope that their sacrifice had not been in vain. Warning that the land they had claimed came with costs that extended beyond mere money or effort. "They would be proud," Elsa said, joining him at the table. "Your parents, they would be proud to see what you built on the foundation they established." "I just wish I had known," Cormac replied. "All these years, thinking I was starting from nothing, when really I was continuing something they had already begun." "Maybe that's what made it possible," Elsa suggested. "If you had known this was your inheritance, you might have felt entitled to it instead of working to earn it. The man who built this homestead had to be someone who could succeed through his own efforts, not someone who relied on what others had done before him." It was a profound observation that reframed the entire narrative of their marriage and family. The mountain man and poor woman, who had been mocked by the town, had actually been the rightful heir to a substantial land claim, and a woman whose strength had been tested and proven through years of hardship. Their success hadn't been an unlikely triumph over impossible. Odds it had been the fulfillment of a destiny that had been waiting decades for the right people to claim it. The faded daguerreotype lay on the table between them, a bridge across time that connected past and present, dreams deferred and dreams fulfilled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in their struggle against Whitmore, but tonight they possessed something they had never had before, the certainty that their fight was not just about defending what they had built, but about honoring what their family had always been meant to achieve. The worn leather Bible had been Elsa's constant companion for 27 years, its pages marked with pressed flowers from their wedding day, birth dates written in careful script, and passages underlined during times of particular struggle or celebration. Tonight, as she sat in the lamplight preparing for the community meeting that would determine their fate, the Bible represented more than faith. It was a repository of family history and a symbol of the values that had sustained them through every crisis. Between the pages of Psalms, she found the dried wildflowers from the meadow where she and Cormac had spoken their vows before a traveling preacher and 3 witnesses. The simple ceremony had been mocked by some as a desperate arrangement between 2 people with no better options, but time had revealed it as the foundation of something far stronger than mere convenience or necessity. The town hall in Bitter Range had never hosted a gathering quite like the one scheduled for this evening. Word had spread throughout the valley that the Judd family would present their case to the community, asking for support in their legal battle against Marcus Whitmore's claim. The response had been mixed, some neighbors expressing solidarity, others maintaining careful neutrality, and a few seeming almost eager to witness the downfall of a family that had risen higher than anyone had expected. Cormac sat across from Elsa at the kitchen table, reviewing the speech he had prepared for the meeting. His weathered hands held notes written in the careful script of a man who had learned to read and write as an adult. Each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood that lives might depend on his ability to communicate clearly and persuasively. "You don't need those notes," Elsa said gently. "You know what needs to be said. Just speak from your heart, the way you always have." He looked up from the papers, his grey eyes reflecting the uncertainty that came with stakes higher than any he had faced before. 27 years ago, half the people in that room laughed when they heard we were getting married. Tonight, I need to convince them to risk their own security to help us keep what we've built. "They're not the same people they were 27 years ago," Elsa replied. "And neither are we. We've all learned things about what matters and what doesn't." The sound of approaching wagons and horses drifted through the evening air, signaling that neighbors were beginning to arrive for the meeting. Each family's decision to attend represented a small act of courage, willingness to become involved in a conflict that could have consequences for the entire community. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing his best shirt and the serious expression that came over him during important family occasions. "Wagons ready whenever you are. Levi's already headed to town to make sure there's no trouble from Whitmore's men." The precaution was necessary. Over the past week, Marcus Whitmore's hired professionals had made their presence felt throughout Bitter Range, visiting businesses, talking to residents, and making it clear that they viewed any support for the Judd family as interference with legitimate legal proceedings. The intimidation was subtle but effective, reminding people that powerful interests were watching their actions. "Where's Asher?" Cormac asked. "Already in town with Elias. They're making sure our evidence is properly displayed and that people can see the documents we found." The family had decided to present their case as completely as possible, including the newly discovered materials that established their historical claim to the land. While the legal proceedings would ultimately determine ownership, community support could influence how local officials handled the dispute and whether other families might face similar challenges in the future. The ride to town passed in relative silence, each family member lost in thoughts about what the evening might bring. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, casting long shadows across the valley that had become their home. It was beautiful country, worth fighting for regardless of legal technicalities or financial considerations. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived, with families occupying benches and chairs in rough groupings that reflected community alliances and loyalties. The Brennans sat near the front, their presence representing the support of established ranchers who understood the broader implications of the dispute. Behind them, smaller farmers and tradespeople filled most of the available seating, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity, concern, and calculation. Near the back of the room, Harrison Pike and two of Whitmore's other representatives observed the proceedings with the detached interest of professionals evaluating a business situation. Their expensive clothes and confident bearing served as reminders that this local gathering was only one small part of a larger strategy designed to achieve predetermined objectives. Thomas Brennan had agreed to serve as moderator for the meeting, his reputation for fairness and his lack of direct involvement in the dispute making him acceptable to all parties. He called the gathering to order and outlined the purpose of the evening to hear the Judd family's case and to discuss what response, if any, the community should make to Whitmore's claim. Cormac rose from his seat and walked to the front of the room, carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had earned respect throughout his years in Bitter Range. He faced the assembled neighbors, friends, and adversaries, understanding that the next few minutes would determine not just his family's future, but their place in the community they had helped to build. 27 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room, most of you thought you were witnessing a mistake. A mountain man who lived alone in the high country was taking a wife, a poor woman with nothing to offer but willing hands and a strong back. People said it wouldn't last a season. They said we were fools to think we could make something out of nothing. The opening acknowledged the history that everyone in the room remembered, the early skepticism and predictions of failure that had followed the young couple as they struggled to establish themselves. By addressing it directly, Cormac removed any power it might have had to undermine his current appeal for support. You were wrong then, and Marcus Whitmore is wrong now. Elsa and I didn't succeed because we were lucky, or because we had advantages that others lacked. We succeeded because we understood something that apparently needs to be said again. Hard work, honest dealing, and commitment to community are worth more than money or legal trickery. He gestured toward the display table where Elias had arranged their evidence, the ledger books showing decades of investment and improvement, the tax records proving continuous ownership, and the newly discovered documents establishing their family's historical claim to the land. These records show what we've accomplished together: $15,000 invested in improvements, taxes paid every year without fail, a working ranch that employs local people and contributes to the prosperity of the entire valley. This isn't just about one family's property, right? It's about whether 27 years of honest achievement can be stolen by someone with enough money to hire lawyers and forge documents. The accusation of forgery created a stir in the audience, with people leaning forward to better hear what would come next. Pike started to rise from his seat, apparently intending to object, but Brennan gestured for him to remain silent during the presentation. We've discovered that Marcus Whitmore has done this before, Cormac continued. At least 6 families in Colorado and Wyoming have lost their property to similar claims. Same pattern. Every time questionable documentation appears just when improved land becomes valuable enough to justify expensive legal proceedings. Elsa watched her husband present their case with the same steady competence he brought to every important task. His words carried the authority of someone who had lived through every claim he made, who could back up every assertion with specific examples and concrete evidence. But this isn't just about our family, Cormac said, his voice rising slightly with controlled passion. If Whitmore succeeds here, how many other families will face similar challenges? How many of you have perfect documentation for property you've owned and improved for decades? How many of you could afford to fight a legal battle against opponents with unlimited resources? The questions hung in the air like smoke from a winter fire, forcing every person in the room to consider their own vulnerability to the kind of predatory behavior that Whitmore represented. Property rights that seemed secure could become suddenly questionable when challenged by someone with sufficient legal and financial resources. We're asking for your support, Cormac concluded, not as charity or favor, but as recognition that what threatens one family in this community threatens all of us. Stand with us now, and we'll stand with you when your turn comes. The speech lasted only 10 minutes, but it encompassed everything essential about their situation and their appeal for community solidarity. As Cormac returned to his seat beside Elsa, The room buzzed with conversations as neighbors discussed what they had heard and what response they felt comfortable making. Brennan opened the floor for questions and comments, beginning a process that would reveal the true depth of community support for the Judd family and their struggle against forces that threatened the security and stability that everyone had worked to achieve. The hidden will lay beneath a loose floorboard in the homestead's original cabin, the one-room structure that had served as Cormac and Elsa's first home and was now used for storage. Asher discovered it while searching for additional family documents that might support their legal case, his persistence rewarded by the creak of a board that moved differently from the others. The document was wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with wax that bore the impression of a signet ring. Unlike the other papers they had found, this will had been prepared by a lawyer and bore official seals from the territorial government. The Dayton 1850 one placed it firmly in the period when Cormac's parents had first established their claim in Bitter Range. "Pa, you need to see this," Asher called, his voice carrying an urgency that brought both Cormac and Elsa running to the old cabin. The will was extensive, running to several pages of legal language that took time to decipher. But its essential message was clear. James Judd had not been a simple homesteader trying to carve out a modest living from wilderness land. He had been the legitimate heir to extensive holdings throughout the Colorado Territory, property that had been granted to his father by the federal government in recognition of military service during the Mexican-American War. "This can't be right," Cormac said, studying the document with growing amazement. "If my grandfather owned all this land, why did we grow up poor in Missouri?" The answer lay in the will's detailed provisions and the family history that it revealed. James Judd had been the younger son of Colonel Robert Judd, a career military officer who had received vast land grants as compensation for distinguished service. The colonel had died unexpectedly in 1850, leaving his estate to be divided between his two sons, James and his older brother Marcus. "Marcus," Elsa repeated, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. "Marcus Judd, not Marcus Whitmore." The implications hit all three of them simultaneously. Their adversary wasn't a stranger with a fraudulent claim to their property. He was Cormac's uncle, the older brother who had apparently spent decades believing himself to be the sole heir to the family estate. According to the will, Colonel Robert Judd had intended for his vast holdings to be divided equally between his sons, with each receiving specific parcels of land and the right to claim additional territory within defined boundaries. James had chosen the Bitter Range area for his portion, while Marcus had been granted property in the lower valleys that was considered more immediately valuable. "But look at this," Asher said, pointing to a crucial passage in the document. "It says that if either brother died without male heirs, his portion would revert to the surviving brother and his descendants." The legal language was complex, but its meaning was clear. Marcus Judd believed that his younger brother had died childless, making him the sole heir to the entire estate. He had waited decades before pressing his claim, probably assuming that any improvements to the land would only increase its value when he finally decided to assert his rights. "He doesn't know you exist," Elsa said quietly. "He thinks his brother died without children, leaving him as the only legitimate heir." The revelation recontextualized everything about their situation. Marcus wasn't trying to steal their property through legal trickery. He genuinely believed it belonged to him by right of inheritance. The forged documents and questionable claims that had seemed like obvious fraud were actually his attempt to establish ownership of land that he thought had always been his. "But why use the name Whitmore?" Cormac asked. Asher found the answer in other papers, hidden with the will correspondence between the brothers, that revealed a bitter dispute over their father's estate and their respective responsibilities for managing it. Marcus had accused James of abandoning his duties to pursue foolish dreams in the wilderness, while James had defended his right to build a life on the land their father had intended for him. The final letter in the collection, dated just months before James's death, contained language that explained everything. "If you insist on this course, Marcus, then you are no brother of mine." Take the Whitmore name that our mother bore, if you're so ashamed of what our father built. But know that this land will belong to my sons when they're old enough to claim it, and no amount of money or legal manipulation will change that." "He changed his name," Cormac said slowly. "Probably after Pa died, when he thought the whole estate was his. He's been using Whitmore to hide the family connection." The discovery transformed their understanding of the conflict from a simple property dispute into a complex family drama that had been brewing for more than 30 years. Marcus had spent decades building wealth and influence under an assumed name, always believing that his brother's portion of the inheritance was rightfully his. Now, faced with evidence that James had actually had a son and heir, he was using his resources to try to maintain control of property that legal documents clearly awarded to Cormac. "We have to tell the others," Elsa said, gathering the precious documents. "This changes our entire legal strategy." They returned to the main house, where Elias was working on correspondence with lawyers and potential witnesses. The revelation of family documents had already strengthened their case considerably, but the discovery of the will and the true identity of their adversary created opportunities they hadn't dared imagine. "You're not going to believe this," Cormac announced as his sons gathered around the kitchen table. The explanation took nearly an hour, with each family member studying the will and related documents while trying to absorb the implications of what they had learned. The legal ramifications were staggering. Not only did they have clear title to their current property, but they potentially had claim to thousands of additional acres throughout the territory. "So, we're rich?" Asher asked, his youth making him focus on the most obvious implications. "We're legitimate," Elias corrected. "Rich is something else entirely, and claiming all this property would probably take years of legal proceedings. But it means our position is much stronger than we thought." Levi had been studying the survey maps that accompanied the will, his strategic mind already working through the tactical implications of their improved situation. "It also means Whitmore Marcus, whoever he has, a lot more to lose than we realized. If we can prove he's been operating under false identity while pressing fraudulent claims, he could face criminal charges. That might be why he's been so aggressive," Silas observed. "He knows the truth about the family connection, and he's trying to establish facts on the ground before we can discover our real legal position." The family spent the rest of the evening developing a new strategy based on their dramatically improved understanding of the situation. Rather than simply defending their current property, they could now go on the offensive, challenging not just Whitmore's specific claim, but his entire pattern of behavior over the past several decades. "We need to be careful," Cormac warned as the discussion wound down. "A man who spent 30 years building a false identity has a lot to protect. If he realizes we know the truth about who he really is, he might become desperate." "What do you think he'll do?" Elsa asked. Cormac considered the question while studying the photograph of his parents that had started this chain of discoveries. The faces that looked back at him seemed to carry warnings about the costs of family conflict and the dangers of letting pride override common sense. "I think he'll try to destroy the evidence and anyone who might testify against him," Cormac said finally. "A man who's come this far won't give up easily, especially when he realizes he's not just fighting for one piece of property, but for his entire life's work." The hidden will lay on the table between them, a document that had waited decades to reveal secrets that would reshape the lives of everyone involved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they worked to use this information effectively, but tonight the Judd family possessed something more valuable than legal advantages: the truth about their heritage and their rightful place in the legacy that Colonel Robert Judd had intended for his descendants. Yet with that knowledge came new dangers. Marcus Judd had spent 30 years as Marcus Whitmore, building wealth and influence that he would not surrender easily. The battle ahead would be more personal and potentially more dangerous than anything they had faced before, pitting family against family in a struggle that went far beyond simple property rights to encompass identity, legitimacy, and the question of which version of the Judd legacy would ultimately prevail. The temporary deputy badge felt heavier in Levi's pocket than its small size should have warranted. Sheriff Morrison had deputized him the previous evening, along with 3 other local men, in response to reports that Marcus Whitmore's hired guns were preparing for what could only be described as an assault on the Judd homestead. It's not legal authority that makes a man effective in situations like this, Morrison had explained while pinning the star-shaped badge to Levi's shirt. It's the willingness to do what's necessary to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. Now, as dawn broke over Bitter Range, that philosophy was about to be tested. Intelligence gathered over the past 3 days suggested that Whitmore had decided to abandon legal proceedings in favor of more direct action. The discovery of the family will and the exposure of his true identity had apparently convinced him that his only chance of success lay in destroying the evidence and intimidating the family into abandoning their claim. Cormac stood at the main house window, his grandfather's Winchester in his hands, watching the approaches to the homestead with the patient alertness of a man who had learned to read danger in the set of distant riders and the flight patterns of disturbed birds. At 52, he remained formidable, but the coming confrontation would test not just his individual capabilities, but the collective strength of a family that had learned to function as a unit. "Positions," he called quietly. "Silas is at the forge, with clear sight lines to the north approach," Levi reported, checking his rifle one final time. "Elias is in the barn loft covering the east trail, Asher's with the horses, ready to ride for help if we need it. And Ma? Inside with the documents, as we discussed. If this goes badly, she'll make sure the evidence survives even if we don't." The strategy was sound but necessarily desperate. 4 men, even with the advantage of familiar ground and prepared positions, would be hard-pressed to defeat the 6 or 8 professionals that Whitmore had assembled. Their hope lay in making the cost of victory so high that their enemies would conclude that legal proceedings offered a more attractive alternative. The morning mist clung to the valley floor, providing concealment that worked to everyone's advantage and no one's. Visibility was limited to a few hundred yards in any direction, creating opportunities for surprise that could favor either attackers or defenders depending on skill and luck. "Movement on the north ridge," Silas called from his position at the forge, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Cormac shifted his attention to the area his eldest son had indicated, scanning the tree line for signs of the watchers who had been observing their property for the past week. The surveillance had become increasingly obvious, as if Whitmore's men wanted the family to know they were being studied and assessed. "I count at least 4 riders," Silas continued, "staying back in the trees, but they're definitely positioning themselves for something." The tactical situation was becoming clear. Whitmore's forces were surrounding the homestead, probably planning to demand surrender of the family documents in exchange for safe passage out of the territory. It was a reasonable strategy from their perspective, achieve their objectives without the risks and complications that would come with actual violence. "Levi, can you see the south approach from your position?" Cormac asked. "Clear so far, but that doesn't mean much with this mist." The limitation was serious. Levi's position in the main house gave him good fields of fire toward the east and north, but the barn and other outbuildings blocked his view of potential southern approaches. If attackers came from multiple directions simultaneously, the family's defensive plan could be overwhelmed quickly. Elsa appeared at Cormac's elbow, moving with the quiet efficiency that had characterized her approach to every crisis over the past 27 years. She carried coffee and food, practical necessities that acknowledged this confrontation might last hours rather than minutes. "The papers are hidden where we discussed," she said quietly. "Multiple copies in different locations. Even if they take the originals, we'll have evidence to present in court." "It may not come to court if this goes badly," Cormac replied. "Then we'll make sure it doesn't go badly." The simple statement carried the weight of absolute commitment. Elsa had never been a woman to accept defeat gracefully, and she wasn't about to start now when everything they had built was at stake. A rifle shot echoed across the valley, followed immediately by Asher's voice, calling from the horse paddock. Riders coming up the main trail, at least 6 of them, riding hard. The frontal approach suggested either supreme confidence or deliberate misdirection. Professional gunmen rarely announced their presence so obviously unless they were trying to draw attention away from their real attack or felt sufficiently superior in numbers to overwhelm any resistance. "Remember the plan?" Cormac called to his sons. "Don't shoot unless they shoot first. We're defending our property, not starting a war." The legal distinction mattered. If the family could claim self-defense, they would have community support and official backing from Sheriff Morrison. If they appeared to be the aggressors, even justified action could be twisted into criminal behavior by lawyers and corrupt officials. The riders came into view through the morning mist, their professional bearing and expensive equipment, marking them clearly as hired guns rather than local men with legitimate grievances. They rode in formation, maintaining intervals that would make them difficult targets while keeping them close enough to provide mutual support. At their head rode Harrison Pike, the lawyer who had delivered Whitmore's original ultimatum. His presence suggested that legal formalities would be observed, even as the threat of violence hung over everything like smoke from a poorly tended fire. The group pulled up at the edge of the yard, close enough to be heard clearly but far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation. Pike dismounted and approached the house on foot, his hands visible and empty in a gesture that might have indicated peaceful intentions, if not for the armed men who remained mounted behind him. "Mr. Judd," Pike called, his voice carrying the formal tone of official business. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Marcus Whitmore to offer you one final opportunity to resolve this matter peacefully." "We're listening," Cormac replied from the porch, his rifle held casually but ready for immediate use. "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to be extremely generous. He'll pay you $50,000 for this property, considerably more than it's worth, and provide transportation to any destination you choose. All you have to do is acknowledge his legitimate claim and surrender any documents that might be used to challenge his ownership." The offer was substantial, representing more money than most families in the territory would see in a lifetime. Yet it also represented complete capitulation and the abandonment of everything the Judd family had worked to achieve. "And if we refuse?" Cormac asked. Pike's expression hardened slightly. "Then Mr. Whitmore will be forced to exercise his legal rights as the property's rightful owner. Squatters who refuse to vacate private land can be removed by any means necessary." The threat was delivered in legal language, but its meaning was unmistakable. Submit or face the consequences of armed resistance to what Whitmore claimed was legitimate authority. "Tell Mr. Whitmore," Cormac said slowly, "that this property belongs to my family by right of inheritance and decades of honest labor. If he wants it, he can present his case in court like any other citizen." "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable," Pike replied, but Mr. Whitmore anticipated this response. He gestured toward his mounted companions, who immediately began spreading out to surround the house and outbuildings. The movement was professional and coordinated, suggesting extensive planning and experience with similar operations. "You have 10 minutes to reconsider," Pike announced. "After that, we'll have to assume you've chosen to resist lawful authority, and we'll respond accordingly." The ultimatum hung in the morning air like the mist that was slowly burning off under the strengthening sun. 10 minutes to surrender 27 years of work and accept the destruction of everything they had built together as a family. "Levi," Cormac called quietly, "signal the others. Let them know it's starting." The temporary deputy badge in Levi's pocket represented more than legal authority. It symbolized the community's recognition that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds. As he prepared to defend his family's home against forces that represented everything corrupt and predatory about territorial law, he understood that the next few minutes would determine not just their immediate survival, but the kind of legacy they would leave for future generations. The homestead that stretched around them had been built through honest labor and sustained through mutual support. Today would test whether those values were strong enough to survive when confronted by money, violence, and the kind of systematic corruption that allowed men like Marcus Whitmore to prosper at the expense of hard-working families. Pike withdrew to rejoin his men, leaving the Judd family with less than 10 minutes to prepare for a confrontation that would determine the fate of everything they had sacrificed to build. The original survey stakes that Cormac's father had hand-carved in 1849 still marked the true boundaries of the Judd property, their weathered wood bearing the initials JJ, and the territorial survey numbers that established legitimate ownership. As Pike's 10-minute ultimatum expired, these modest markers became the physical symbols of a conflict that would determine whether honest work could triumph over money and corruption. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the critical moment, his badge catching the morning sunlight as he rode up the main trail with 2 additional deputies. His timing was deliberate, close enough to witness whatever violence might occur, but late enough to avoid being blamed for starting it. "Mr. Pike," Morrison called, his voice carrying the authority of legitimate law enforcement, "I need to see your warrants for this eviction." The lawyer's confidence faltered slightly. He had been operating under the assumption that his employer's wealth and influence would be sufficient to intimidate local officials, but Morrison's reputation for integrity was well established throughout the territory. "Sheriff, this is a civil matter between property owners. Mr. Whitmore has clear documentation establishing his rights to this land. Then he can present that documentation in court, same as anyone else. Until then, the Judd family has the right to remain on property they've occupied and improved for 27 years. The exchange shifted the tactical balance significantly. Morrison's presence meant that any violence would be witnessed by neutral authorities, making it difficult for Whitmore's men to claim they were acting in self-defense or pursuant to legal authority. Pike conferred quietly with his mounted companions, their body language suggesting disagreement about how to proceed. The plan had apparently relied on intimidating the family into submission without official interference, but Morrison's arrival had complicated that strategy considerably. "Sheriff," Pike said finally, "I have to advise you that Mr. Whitmore's claim to this property is supported by documentation dating back to the original territorial grants. The current occupants are essentially squatters who have refused reasonable offers to vacate peacefully." "That's for a judge to decide," Morrison replied firmly. "What I see here is armed men threatening a family on their own property. Unless you have warrants signed by territorial authorities, I'm ordering you to withdraw immediately." The legal confrontation provided Elias with the opening he had been waiting for. He emerged from the barn, carrying the leather satchel that contained copies of all their evidence, including the recently discovered will and family documents. "Sheriff Morrison," he called, "we have documentation that proves our family's legitimate claim to this property, documents that predate anything Mr. Whitmore has produced." The statement created visible tension among Pike's men. Several of them shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to weapons as they realized their mission was becoming more complicated than anticipated. "What kind of documentation?" Morrison asked, dismounting and walking toward the house. Elias opened the satchel and withdrew the territorial deed signed by James Judd in 1849. Along with the will that established the family's inheritance rights. "This deed shows that my grandfather claimed this land legally more than 30 years ago. This will prove that my father is the legitimate heir to the entire estate." Morrison examined the documents carefully, his experience with territorial law enabling him to recognize authentic legal papers. The deed was clearly legitimate, bearing the proper seals and signatures of territorial authorities. The will was more complex, but its legal language and official authentication suggested it had been prepared by competent lawyers. "These appear to be in order," Morrison announced. "Mr. Pike, do you have anything that predates 1849? The lawyer's silence provided its own answer. Whitmore's claim had been based on forged documents and falsified dates, but he had never possessed anything that could challenge legitimate papers from the earliest days of territorial settlement. "I'll need to consult with my client," Pike said finally. "You do that," Morrison replied, "but you'll do it away from this property. These folks have legal rights that I'm sworn to protect, and that's exactly what I intend to do." The confrontation might have ended there, with Whitmore's men withdrawing to regroup and plan a different approach, but the sound of additional riders approaching from the south changed the tactical situation once again. Marcus Whitmore himself appeared at the head of a second group of mounted men, his expensive clothes and authoritative bearing marking him as someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. At 65, he remained formidable, his grey hair and weathered features suggesting a man who had fought many battles and won most of them. "Sheriff Morrison," he said, dismounting and approaching with the confidence of someone who believed his wealth and influence made him untouchable. "This is a family matter that doesn't require official interference." "Family matter?" Morrison replied. "I understood you were Marcus Whitmore from Denver, claiming property rights based on territorial documentation." The moment of truth had arrived. Whitmore's entire strategy had been based on concealing his true identity and his family connection to the disputed property. Now, faced with official scrutiny and documentary evidence that exposed his deception, he was forced to choose between maintaining his masquerade and acknowledging the blood relationship that might give his claim some legitimacy. "I am Marcus Judd," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that ended 30 years of careful deception. "That man," he pointed toward Cormac, "is my nephew, the son of a brother who abandoned his responsibilities and died in poverty because of his own poor judgment." The admission created a stir among the assembled men, with Pike's hired guns exchanging glances that suggested this revelation had not been part of their briefing. Even Morrison seemed surprised by the family connection, though his expression remained professionally neutral. "Then this is indeed a family matter," Morrison acknowledged. "But it's still a legal dispute that needs to be resolved in court, not at gunpoint." Cormac stepped forward, his grandfather's Winchester, held in a way that suggested competence without immediate threat. For the first time in his life, he was face to face with his father's older brother, the man whose abandonment of family responsibility had forced James Judd to struggle alone in the wilderness. "Uncle Marcus," he said quietly, the word carrying decades of unspoken pain and resentment. "Pa waited for you to come back and help with the homestead. Ma said he wrote letters that were never answered. He died thinking his family had forgotten him. Your father was a fool." Marcus replied harshly. "He chose that worthless piece of mountain ground over profitable land in the lower valleys. I offered to help him make better choices, but he was too stubborn to listen. He chose the land our grandfather intended for him, the land you're now trying to steal through forged documents and hired guns." The accusation hung in the morning air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just a property dispute, but the resolution of family conflicts that had been festering for more than 3 decades. Morrison stepped between the two men, his badge catching the sunlight as he assumed the authority that came with representing legitimate law and order. The survey stakes that had started this confrontation remained visible in the distance, silent witnesses to the struggle between honest achievement and predatory greed that would determine not just the fate of one family, but the principles that would govern their community. Cormac's handwritten letter to Elsa had never been intended for anyone else to see. Written during the darkest period of their early marriage, when failure seemed more likely than success and the weight of community skepticism threatened to crush their fragile hopes, it contained thoughts and feelings he had never been able to speak aloud. Now, as the confrontation with his uncle reached its climax, Elsa withdrew the letter from her Bible and handed it to her husband with the quiet strength that had sustained their family through every crisis. "Read it," she said simply. "Let him understand what we built here." The letter was worn from handling, its pages soft with age and marked by tears that had fallen during the lonely winter nights, when Cormac had struggled to find words for emotions that seemed too large for simple language. "My dearest Elsa," he read aloud, his voice carrying across the assembled men like a prayer. "I know they laugh at us in town. I know they say we're fools for thinking we can make something from nothing. But when I look at you working beside me, never complaining about the cold or the hunger or the loneliness, I see something they don't understand. Marcus, shifted uncomfortably, his expensive clothes and hired guns suddenly seeming less impressive in the face of words that spoke to deeper truths about commitment and partnership. I see the woman who chose to stand with me not because I could offer her comfort or security, but because she believed we could build something together that would be worth the sacrifice. You've given me strength I didn't know I possessed and hope I didn't dare feel. Whatever we accomplish here will be as much yours as mine. The letter continued for several paragraphs, detailing the struggles and small victories that had marked their early years together. Each passage revealed the depth of gratitude and love that had grown between two people who had been dismissed as an unlikely pairing doomed to failure. They said you deserved better than a mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness. Maybe they were right. But what they didn't understand is that you made me better than I was, better than I ever thought I could be. The sons we'll raise together will carry your strength and your wisdom, and the world will be better because of what you chose to build with me. Sheriff Morrison listened with the respectful attention of a man who understood that he was witnessing something far more important than a simple property dispute. The hired guns shifted in their saddles, their professional detachment challenged by words that spoke to universal experiences of love, sacrifice, and the bonds that held families together. "That's enough," Marcus said harshly, but his voice lacked the conviction that had marked his earlier pronouncements. "Sentimental nonsense doesn't change the legal facts about property ownership." "The legal facts," Cormac replied, folding the letter carefully and returning it to Elsa, "are that this land belongs to my family by right of inheritance, legal claim, and 27 years of honest labor. The real question is why you've spent 30 years hiding behind a false name instead of working with us to honor what our grandfather intended." The challenge struck at the heart of Marcus's carefully constructed identity. As Marcus Whitmore, he had been a successful businessman with the resources to buy whatever he wanted. As Marcus Judd, he was the older brother who had abandoned family responsibilities in pursuit of easier profits, leaving his younger sibling to struggle alone in the wilderness. "I built an empire," Marcus said, his voice rising with defensive anger. "Thousands of acres, successful businesses, influence that extends throughout the territory. What did your father accomplish? A one-room cabin and an early grave." "He accomplished something you never understood," Elsa interjected, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from having lived through every word of the letter Cormac had just read. "He chose love over money, family over profit, and the kind of success that can't be bought or stolen." The statement created a moment of profound silence, with even the hired guns seeming to recognize that they were witnessing a confrontation between fundamentally different approaches to life and success. Asher stepped forward from his position near the horses, his youth making his intervention all the more powerful. "You want to know what Pa accomplished? He raised 4 sons who would rather die than surrender what we built together. That's a legacy that will outlast all your money and influence." The declaration was followed by similar statements from Silas, Levi, and Elias, each son adding his voice to the family's unified rejection of Marcus's claims and values. Their solidarity, forged through years of shared struggle and mutual support, presented a moral authority that transcended legal technicalities or financial resources. Morrison watched the family dynamics with growing understanding of what was really at stake. This wasn't simply about property rights or even family conflict. It was about whether the values that had built communities like Bitter Range could survive against the kind of predatory capitalism that Marcus Whitmore represented. "Mr. Judd," Morrison said, addressing Marcus directly, "you have 2 choices. You can withdraw your claim and leave this family in peace, or you can face charges for fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit violence against innocent citizens." The ultimatum was delivered with the calm authority of someone who understood both the law and the community values he was sworn to protect. Pike and the hired guns looked to Marcus for guidance, but his expensive clothes and confident bearing could no longer conceal the uncertainty of a man whose carefully planned strategy had collapsed. "This isn't over," Marcus said finally, but his words lacked conviction. The family unity he faced represented something he had never learned to understand or value, and his hired professionals were proving inadequate against opponents who fought not for money, but for principles they held more precious than life itself. "Yes, it is," Cormac replied with quiet finality. "It ended the day you chose money over family, profit over principle. Go back to Denver, Uncle Marcus. Build your empire on land that doesn't belong to someone else." The confrontation was resolved not through violence, but through the moral clarity that came from 30 years of choosing difficult paths and honoring difficult commitments. As Marcus and his men withdrew, the survey stakes that had witnessed the confrontation stood as silent reminders that some boundaries were worth defending, regardless of the cost or the odds. The handwritten letter that had revealed the foundation of Cormac and Elsa's partnership returned to its place in the worn Bible, its words having served their purpose of demonstrating that the strongest claims to any property were those written not in legal documents, but in the hearts of people who had earned their place through love, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to each other. The new family portrait was taken 6 months after the confrontation, when the legal proceedings had finally concluded and the Judd family's ownership of their expanded holdings had been confirmed by territorial courts. The professional photographer from Denver had captured something that went beyond mere documentation. He had preserved a moment when 4 generations of struggle and sacrifice had finally achieved the recognition and security they deserved. Cormac stood in the center of the group, his hand resting on Elsa's shoulder, in a gesture that spoke to decades of partnership and mutual support. The weathered lines on his face told stories of hardship overcome and challenges met, but his eyes reflected the quiet satisfaction of a man who had proved wrong everyone who had bet against him. Elsa sat beside him with the serene dignity of a woman who had chosen the difficult path and found it led to something more valuable than comfort or security. Her dark dress was simple but well made, a reminder that prosperity had not changed the practical values that had sustained her through the early years of their marriage. Their 4 sons stood behind them, each one representing a different aspect of the strength that had made their family's success possible. Silas held his blacksmith's hammer, the tool that had connected their struggle to the broader community that depended on his skills. Levi wore his permanent deputy's badge, his appointment as Sheriff Morrison's chief deputy, reflecting the respect he had earned through courage and integrity. Elias carried the leather-bound ledger that had documented their rise from poverty to prosperity, his careful records having provided crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that confirmed their ownership of thousands of acres throughout the territory. Asher stood tall and confident, no longer the uncertain youngest son, but a young man who had found his purpose in the successful completion of dangerous missions that had exposed Marcus Whitmore's pattern of predatory behavior. The expanded homestead stretched behind them in the photograph, its buildings and improvements representing not just economic success, but the physical manifestation of dreams that had seemed impossible to everyone except the 2 people who had committed themselves to achieving them. The legal victory had been complete. Marcus Whitmore had withdrawn his claims rather than face criminal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy. His hired guns had dispersed, and the territorial courts had ruled definitively in favor of the Judd family's ownership rights. More importantly, the precedent established by their case had protected other families from similar predatory schemes, demonstrating that honest achievement could triumph over money and corruption when communities stood together in defense of shared values. "It's hard to believe it's really over," Elsa said as they studied the finished portrait in the comfort of their expanded living room. "It's not over," Cormac replied thoughtfully. "It's just beginning. We've got thousands of acres to manage now, responsibilities to the community, and 4 sons who need to find their own ways of carrying forward what we've built." The responsibilities were indeed substantial. The legal proceedings had confirmed their ownership of not just the original homestead, but extensive additional holdings throughout the Bitter Range area. Managing such a large estate would require careful planning, significant investment, and the kind of long-term thinking that had always characterized their approach to building for the future. "Silas wants to expand the blacksmith operation," Elsa observed. He's talking about bringing in apprentices, maybe even opening a second shop in Colorado Springs. Good for him. The territory needs skilled craftsmen, and he's earned the right to build something of his own. Levi's been offered a position as territorial marshal. It would mean traveling throughout Colorado, but he'd have authority to pursue men like your uncle who prey on honest families. That sounds like Levi, always wanting to protect people who can't protect themselves. The conversation continued as they discussed each son's plans and prospects. Elias intended to use his trading connections and financial expertise to develop new markets for their livestock and agricultural products. Asher had expressed interest in exploring the vast mountain holdings that had come with their inheritance, possibly establishing mining operations or timber harvests that could provide additional income streams. "And what about us?" Elsa asked quietly. "We've spent 27 years building this place. What do we do now that we've achieved everything we dreamed of?" It was a profound question that went to the heart of what success meant for people who had defined themselves through struggle and the pursuit of seemingly impossible goals. The poverty and uncertainty that had driven their early efforts were gone, replaced by security and prosperity that exceeded anything they had dared imagine. "We do what we've always done," Cormac replied after long consideration. "We work, we build, and we take care of the people who depend on us. The only difference is that now we're doing it by choice rather than necessity." The distinction was important. Where once they had been driven by the need to prove wrong those who had predicted their failure, now they were motivated by the desire to use their success in ways that honored the values and principles that had made their achievements possible. Over the following months, the Judd family became a source of stability and leadership throughout the Bitter Range area. Their expanded operations provided employment for dozens of local families. Their financial resources supported community improvements like schools and churches, and their example demonstrated that honest work and mutual support could overcome any obstacle. The town that had once laughed at the unlikely pairing of a mountain man and a poor woman now looked to the Judd family for guidance on everything from business decisions to community disputes. The transformation was complete, from objects of mockery to pillars of respectability, from struggling homesteaders to the most prosperous and respected family in the territory. Yet perhaps the most significant change was in how they saw themselves. The insecurity and desperate determination that had marked their early years had been replaced by quiet confidence and the kind of deep satisfaction that came from having proved their worth, not just to skeptical neighbors, but to themselves. "Do you ever think about those early days?" Elsa asked one evening as they sat on the expanded porch of their considerably enlarged house. "Every day," Cormac admitted, "but differently than I used to. Instead of remembering the hardship and uncertainty, I think about how everything we went through was preparing us for what we have now. The people who laughed at us, do you think they understand now what we were really doing?" Cormac considered the question while watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The valley spread before them like a living testament to what could be accomplished when two people committed themselves fully to a shared vision and refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon them. "Some do, some don't," he replied finally. "But it doesn't matter anymore. We didn't build this place to prove anything to them. We built it because we knew what we were capable of achieving together." The family portrait that documented their triumph lay on the table between them, its formal poses and careful composition capturing a moment when decades of struggle had finally achieved the recognition and security they deserved. Yet the real victory wasn't in the photograph or the legal documents or the expanded holding sit, was in the knowledge that they had chosen each other wisely and built something together that would endure long after they were gone. As darkness settled over the Bitter Range and lights began to appear in the windows of neighboring homesteads, Cormac and Elsa sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by everything they had worked to achieve and sustained by the certainty that their legacy would continue through the sons who carried their values and the community that had learned to respect what honest partnership could accomplish against any odds.